So, welcome everybody to the fourth and final webinar in our series that's all about how to run the world's best B2B customer generating webinars. Today's session is all about what to do after the webinar itself, how to drive pipeline generation and push opportunities towards the close after the webinar itself. Who's speaking today? Well, we did have Scott at Cowley that was billed to come along today, but unfortunately he's not going to be able to make it. I did record a podcast with him last week though, so we've got a short snippet from the podcast that we're going to play in the session today in lieu of him being live. We've also got Daniel Rose. He's a brilliant B2B copywriter. I've worked with him a number of times. And he's written sales and customer engagement copy for some of the biggest and best tech companies in the world. And myself, I'm Tom Parker. I'm the CMO at Atomley. If you've come to any of the previous sessions, you will have seen me before. I've got 4 years of hands-on experience running webinars, prepared, hosted and run dozens of them over my career, and also 10 years of broader sales and marketing experience. Just one thing to say before we get going, I currently have COVID. I got out of bed to do this today. I've been unwell for the last couple of days, but I'm really keen to do it. So I have to apologize if my voice is a little bit hoarse, but we're going to push through anyway. So what is the kind of key objective? Why are we here? Why have we been running this whole series of webinars in the first place? So we're here to help the world help B2B firms run the world's best webinars. And those webinars are designed to generate customers and revenue, but we do that in a very non-salesy way. We do it in a way where we're sharing useful and helpful content and thought leadership. And the whole purpose of this is to increase revenue and drive customer acquisition. We've got some news today that we wanted to share off the back of doing this whole series of webinars over the last couple of months. And that is that we're going to be launching a webinar masterclass this summer. So everyone that joins the session today or watches it on demand will be invited to take advantage of a free introductory session in the masterclass. But I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later on. First of all, just going to recap what we've talked about over the last 2 months, the series so far. So those of you that have been before, you will have seen this slide a couple of times. The way that we break down the webinar process is into 3 component parts. So we talk about acquisition, we talk about delivery, and we talk about conversion. In other words, acquisition is the pre-webinar activity, delivery is the during the webinar activity, and conversion is the post-webinar activity. If you've missed any of the previous 3 sessions that we've run, 2 of which cover the acquisition and the delivery portions, we're going to share the links to a landing page that contains all the recordings afterwards. You can also follow me on LinkedIn as well to find snippets and tidbits of that have been cut up if you've only got a couple of minutes to spare. So please do follow me on LinkedIn and follow through that link when we share it afterwards so that you can see the rest of the content that we've produced over the last couple of months. So what are we covering today? Well, today it's all about the conversion piece. So what to do after the webinar has actually happened, and mainly how to use the results of the surveys and the engagement that you've had during your webinar to actually start to drive audience engagement after the webinar, to generate a pipeline and to start to close deals off the back of that. If you're really clever with the way that you follow up your audience, you can ease into a much more productive and successful sales cycle. And that's what we're all about here, is driving leads down into a sales cycle. So one of the biggest problems with webinars that we've heard and that we see time and time again is that hosts are doing very, very little post-webinar activity. They do all of the pre and the during activity. They get it all set up perfectly, or maybe not so perfectly in some cases. They run the webinar and then they think, okay, job done. Thank goodness for that. I've finished, however many 20 people have seen it, that's good enough. And they do very little in terms of follow-up activity after the webinar itself. And that's no good for generating revenue or enhancing customer engagement. So that's exactly what we're trying to fix. The way that we think we can fix that is by encouraging hosts to think much longer term when they're looking at their webinars. So what we want them to do is think, what could I be doing post-webinar to give myself the best chance of success, and success being revenue generation in this case, or customer generation. So the work doesn't stop when you actually do the webinar, it's just the start of the post-webinar journey. So it's where the real work begins if you want to start to drive those sales results. So the webinar itself is all about the transfer of value across to your audience through the thought leadership and the education that you provide. And that is done to build trust primarily with your audience. But usually running one webinar and initially building trust doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to go and convert a load of customers afterwards. So what's the rest of the process that follows on from that? Well, the next step for us is all about gathering, aggregating, and doing something with the data that you captured during the webinar. So the webinar is laying the groundwork for your follow-up campaigns. And the crucial part of that is the data collection mechanism that you use to be able to start to collect the data that's going to ultimately engage your audience in your post-webinar process. And if you do that effectively and you've built trust and you've built data, then you can start to do sales campaigns, which we're going to call, for the purpose of this webinar, spear phishing, targeted sales campaigns at specific individuals that have attended or registered for your event. And beyond that, we also talk about marketing, which is more of a fishing with nets type strategy. So you've collected your data, you've got your immediate pipeline of sales leads that you're going to go after with your spear phishing campaign. But then there's a whole load of other things that you can do after the webinar in order to generate longer term results. And that's all about content marketing and casting that net as wide as possible and giving yourself as much of a chance of catching additional people that weren't actually on the webinar itself on the day, and driving those people towards the on-demand recordings and all of the other great content that you're going to produce afterwards. And I'm going to tell you today how to actually produce that content and get it out there into the world so that people will start to watch it, read it, and engage with it. So let's break that process down. First of all, we're going to look at the data, so the collection and utilization of data that comes out the back end of our webinars. So what are the challenges or the problems that are typically associated that we find in our research and talking to our customers? What are the challenges with data collection and aggregation? Well, the first one is not collecting it at all. So not doing a survey, not asking questions is one surefire way of not collecting any data or information about your audience. So if you came to the last webinar, you'll know that there was a statistic that I mentioned last time. 80% of all webinars that were conducted in 2021 didn't include any kind of surveying. That includes things like polling during the event, but also the survey, post-event surveys as well that you can issue. And by the time that you've realized this and you want to rectify it and you want to go and collect data after the event, it's too late and people have moved on. Also, if you're issuing post-event surveys through the typical automated email that you can send through Zoom or GoToWebinar, typically only 16% of people are actually going to be filling that in anyway, according to GoToWebinar, which is a very low number. Second problem is that follows on from that is you don't know who your highest intent leads actually are. So if you don't collect the information from your audience, you don't know which ones of those audience are the best ones to go after, which ones have the highest intent, which ones have the strongest intent, who actually wants to buy or engage in a sales conversation about your products and services. So it makes it very difficult to sell to them if you don't have any of that information and you can't understand who has the highest intent. And it also means that you don't know who you're going to follow up with first, because if you don't collect the information, how can you prioritize and work out who to go after first? So to use the spear phishing analogy that I was talking about, you're effectively going out in the dark with your spear, trying to hunt in the dark. You don't know which direction you should be going and who you should be going after first and what their reaction is going to be when you do reach them. So questions like, who should we be speaking to? How should we be communicating with them? How can we reduce the risk of wasting the limited sales resources that we have? And even the largest sales organizations have a limitation on their resource. So unless we ask people questions and survey our attendees, we won't know the answers to any of these questions. And it's going to make it very difficult to then follow into a sales process afterwards. So what does good look like in terms of collecting and actioning data? So first of all, we very strongly believe that surveying live or during the on-demand, if someone's watching it on demand, surveying them while the webinar is actually playing in the background is the best way to collect data from them. While they're engaged, leverage the opportunity to collect information from them, and they will quite happily give up the information to you if it's posed in the right way and if it's requested from them at the right time. So this boosts that response rate from 16%, which is the 2021 average according to GoToWebinar, to 70+% in the surveys that we run through Atomley, which are done live during the event, and you'll see this later on today. Secondly is defining your lead criteria. We spoke about this last time as well. We introduced the concept of an Atomley qualified lead, which sits between a marketing qualified lead and a sales qualified lead. In our language, an Atomley qualified lead is someone that turns up to the event, fills in the survey during the event, and exhibits a positive buying intent from the questions that we ask them. And these are the people that we know that we want to go after because they've exhibited a positive buying intent and they've said that they want us to actually get back in touch with them. So they are open to being sold to, and that's the whole purpose of opening the door with a webinar in the first place, of course. But it's also important to define what you consider as an MQL. So you go back to the last webinar if you want a full description of each of these terms and how to classify them. But an MQL is also important for that net fishing that I was talking about at the start, but we'll come on to that a little bit later. And then once you've got all of the information, you need to start to prioritize who you go after first and how you go after them by bucketing them up into different categories. So the categories that we use are gold, silver, and bronze. This was developed with Will It Make the Boat Go Faster, which is a client of ours that has an Olympic gold medalist at the head of the company. The CEO is an ex-Olympian. So we chose this methodology. Gold means that they filled in the survey, they exhibited positive intent, buying intent across multiple questions in the survey, and they gave positive feedback on the content and the host as well. So those are our top priority, our Atomley qualified leads. And then that goes down through to bronze, who just attended the event, didn't fill in the survey at all, but we know that they did attend, so they exhibit some kind of intent by showing up. And those are the ones that need to be nurtured further. So we go from gold through silver to bronze, and that's the order in which we would go after people in a sales process after the event. Beyond that, we also have everyone else, so all the people that engaged with our content but never registered, or the people that registered but never showed up. We do want to go after those people, but those we're going to reserve for that net fishing. So spear fishing is all about gold and silver in the way that we do it. And if you want more information about this, you can email me and I can talk you through how we go about doing this, how you should approach different groups, gold, silver, or bronze, with a different methodology. So let's talk about that spear fishing in particular and how to go about actually doing that. So what issues might you face when you aim to go out and do some targeted sales after the event itself? So first of all, you might find that the intent data that you gather through the surveys and the engagement that you have on the webinar might not actually be enough to help you to understand whether the person is a buyer, whether they're a decision maker, whether they've got budget, etc. They might be closed off and not necessarily offer all that information up. So that information is part of a broader puzzle, and we're going to help you kind of solve the rest of that puzzle in a second. Secondly, people at the moment in the industry aren't properly personalizing their follow-ups. So automation is obviously great and lots of people are using it, but when you've got a gold or a silver list candidate that's gone through your webinar, you know their name, you know their job title, you know lots about them, and their intent and what problems they have and the fact that they're looking to solve them. So use that information, be personal with them, do one-to-one personalized outreach, don't just use automation all the time. So we're finding that people aren't doing that at the moment very well. They might even be just being lazy. When there's automation, it does happen. Next, we find that people aren't using the content of the webinar as a conversational hook. So again, they might have all this great information, they pick up the phone to go and speak to their gold list member, and they don't mention the webinar itself or the content, so they're not actually using that as a conversational hook. And it's a gold mine of content and of talking points and icebreakers that you've got there, so you should really be using those as much as possible. And then the fourth problem that we find is that prospects aren't necessarily progressing down the funnel, so turning into a sales qualified lead, turning into a valid sales opportunity. This is true of any sales funnel, of course, but with a webinar, you've got a much warmer opportunity to push people down quicker and much smoother than otherwise. So I'm going to teach you a little bit about how to do that in a second as well. So how do we solve those challenges? How do we take advantage of all of this data and the fact that we know who we're going after? We're targeting these specific leads after the event. So first of all, doing additional research is really important. So like I said, it's a jigsaw. You don't have all of the information. For an experienced salesperson, this is an obvious thing to say. Obviously you need to do more research, but filling in the context of why someone said, I am currently struggling with X and I'm looking to solve that problem and I have a budget to solve that problem. This is all stuff that we would find out from the survey. You need to then add context to why is that a problem? Why are they looking at it now? What's the purpose for turning up on the webinar today to learn something about that, right? So as an example, when I sell our services off the back of our webinars or any sales process that I run for this, for selling our services at Atomley, I will go to the lead's website. I'll look and see if they do podcasts or webinars at the moment, because that gives me an idea of how open they are to running them or how much experience they have with running them. And then I watch some of their content, I get ideas for what they've been doing so far, and then I write a list of suggestions. So when I get on a call with them, I know their pain points, but I also know what they've done so far to try and alleviate those, so I can start to add some flavor, start to do some consultative selling. Starting the conversation based on the responses. So again, you've got all this great information, you need to use it, right? So asking them, what resonated with you most in the content? Why did you answer the polls in the way that you answered them? Why did you ask that particular question during the Q&A? Like, what was the reason behind asking that question? Why did you say yes to a particular question in the survey? So using all of that data, which you can gather very easily through if you've got a comprehensive system to do that, like we do, you can start to ask those questions and get really valid answers to those questions and drive a sales conversation from there. Also, to help with moving people down through the funnel, making sure that you follow through with your pre-sales offer. So as part of Atomley, we always recommend that people create what we call a pre-sales offer. So it could be, for example, a free space on the masterclass or a free session in the masterclass, which is what we're offering today, a free consultation, a free trial of your software, whatever it is that you can offer that adds value. Make sure that you actually follow through with that, and then it will start to push people down through the funnel. So you have your discovery call with them after the webinar. You ask them, when do you want to redeem that pre-sales offer? When can you get going with this project? And that will start to move people down through the funnel. But of course, some people just aren't ready to buy. They don't have the information that they need. They don't have the sort of requisite buyers that need to be involved in the process bought in yet, or they don't have the budget signed yet. And that's fine. What we're aiming to do with this is to create a content marketing strategy around webinars as well, so that we can confidently throw a lead back into the pool, into the prospect pool. And we know that they're going to be nurtured by our marketing team or our marketing activity. And maybe in a quarter's time, they'll come to the next webinar that we put on. They will have got the budget, got everyone on board, done all the research that they needed to do, and then they'll put their hand up and say, okay, I'm ready to go through that sales conversation with you again now. So being confident in putting people back into the nurturing cycle is really important. So don't apply too much pressure, be confident to put them back in and recycle them again later. And the final part of this puzzle is the net fishing, so the marketing piece. So what are the problems with marketing when it comes to webinars? Well, or post-webinar, should I say. One of the biggest issues that we find is people just put the full recording up on a page on their website that's not very well promoted in a dark corner of the internet somewhere. And it sits among thousands and thousands of other things on YouTube or Vimeo, for example, and it's effectively sentenced to death. because no one's ever going to watch it if you're not promoting it, signposting it, and it's not being put into a format that people actually want to watch and listen to. And then the other problem is people do that and then they're disappointed when no one watches it and they wonder why. And to us, it's not a surprise that people don't go and watch it, because, you know, when was the last time, for example, have a think about this, when was the last time you took time out of your busy schedule to go and watch a full on-demand webinar that's an hour long, for example? People just don't have the time to do that nowadays. Another thing as well might be that people are watching it, but you just don't have the tools to track whether they are watching it or not. And we're going to come on to how to solve that problem in a second as well. Another issue, people don't leverage the long tail. What we mean by that is you've got the recording itself, but what about all the other stuff that can sit around that? That's what we call satellite content. What about all the other types of content that we can produce off the back of a webinar? And people typically aren't really creating that or promoting that in the right way at the moment, we find. So we're going to give you some tips for how to do that. And then only engaging with the actual attendees is a real sin, to be honest, in the webinar world, because people, 100 people register regularly for events online. Maybe 15, 20, 30 people actually turn up. So the other 70, 80 people that didn't turn up, they still showed some kind of intent by registering. Obviously, they were interested at the time when they clicked to register. So it doesn't mean that we should leave those people behind. So we should be looking to engage with those people as well. And that's what this net phishing is all about. So how do we solve all of those problems that I just spoke about? First of all, creation of a content marketing plan is critically important. And doing that before you actually get to the day where you need to execute it is really important as well. So the sorts of questions that you need to be answering with your plan are: where does my audience hang out? So where do I need to be posting content? What types of formats and types of content are they used to seeing? So some people are, audio learners, visual learners. Some people like to do interactive stuff. So you need to find a way to engage with the audience in the place and in the format that they like to be engaged in. And then obviously you need to wrap all of that up with, well, what's our available budget and resource to do this? Obviously, we'd love to do everything in the world, but we can't necessarily do that. So it's about being smart and choosing the types of content that you should be producing. The way that we actually go about doing this ourselves is we use ClickUp, project management tool. You could use Asana, Monday, an Excel spreadsheet, doesn't really matter. And we plan it all out 4 to 6 weeks ahead of the webinar. So we're already planning the post-webinar activity before we even start promoting the webinar itself for the pre-marketing. And we plan it all out, and we make sure that everyone on the team has been assigned, different tasks to be creating different types of content. And so when the webinar is finished, within 24 hours, we can start to execute that content marketing plan straight away with no delay. Another thing that's great is to use a shareable snippet strategy, what we call a shareable snippet strategy. So you've got your full hour-long recording, chunk that up into 2-minute pieces, which could be audio or video or both, and then post those in various different formats in different places. People are much more likely to consume content that's a couple of minutes long, and then they might actually go on to watch the full recording if that takes their interest, if that piques their interest by watching a couple of minutes of it to start with. And then also mixing up the format of that, so audiograms, GIFs, infographics, podcasts, hosting, a follow-up webinar or an AMA session, blogs, articles, landing pages. There's so many things that you could do with this content, or could do around the topic of the content that you spoke about on the webinar. So what we say is write blogs and articles that dive deeper into specific topics that you spoke about in broad strokes on the webinar. Maybe do a podcast with the guest that you had on the webinar to expand on their thoughts a little bit more. There's loads of stuff that you can do here. So if you want ideas for this, again, when you answer the survey, just fill in to say that you want to have a follow-up with us, and I'll walk you through all the different ways that you can do all of these things. Another thing that we often get is people don't know how to actually do all of that, which is fair enough. And people just post up the recording because they don't know how to produce all these other bits and bobs. So actually what we find is outsourcing it reduces the cost of doing it because your time is valuable as a senior person within the business, but also the quality is probably going to be better as well if it's not your forte. So finding people on Upwork or Fiverr, again, send me an email. We've got a list of approved suppliers. Daniel, for example, that's going to be speaking in a minute, is one of those that does a copywriting for us and writes articles for us sometimes. So finding those people, getting them to do it on your behalf, reduces cost, increases quality. Distribution via multiple channels is obviously really important. So social media, blog page on your website, industry specific sites like GitHub or maybe Slack channels that you're part of that have sort of industry communities, including it in your email newsletter. You need to recycle this content into as many different channels and formats as possible in order to get the most reach that you can and get the most eyeballs on it. And also, if you had a guest on your webinar, utilizing their network and their distribution channels is also going to be really important as well. When it comes to hosting the content, putting it all on a landing page is really good. So we've got a landing page that houses all of the recordings for the last 3 that we've done, and making sure that you've hooked that up to your CRM and that you're actually tracking all the data that comes along with that. So then if someone puts themselves up if someone engages with that landing page multiple times, we know who they are in the CRM. We should then go out and reach out to them proactively. Which brings me on to my final point, which is when you're doing all of this marketing net fishing activity, you can also throw a spear in there as well, right? So it might be someone that didn't engage on the actual day live itself, but they've engaged a lot with the content afterwards. You should be reaching out to those people and engaging them. So this is really an aligned strategy between sales and marketing. Okay, I've spoken enough. I've actually gone over time a little bit. Apologies. So like I said earlier, we've got some news. My co-founder Hugh and I have been working on a webinar masterclass recently. It's planned to be launched later on in the summer. It's going to be a very tactical, hands-on. It's not like these typical masterclasses where they just throw like a 100-page book at you and tell you to go and self-learn. This is very hands-on. We'll run a 12-week masterclass process that aligns exactly to the 12-week process that we deliver for our customers when we build and run webinars on behalf of our clients. And so you will go through exactly the same process, and on week 8 or week 9 of that 12-week process, you will actually run your own webinar, and we're going to be on hand to support with that, with all the knowledge and materials that you need, and also the community of the other people that are in the masterclass as well, supporting you with that. So that's being launched later in the summer. If you complete the survey today, which I'm going to put up on the screen in a second, you can claim a free initial training session that goes in as part of that masterclass. And we'll also, as always, be donating a meal on your behalf to the charity Magic Breakfast as well. Right, interview time. As I said, unfortunately, Scott was unable to make it today, but that's fine. So what I'm going to do is play a really brief snippet from the podcast that I did with him recently. Let me just get that loaded up. Switch my audio across here.
When you get to those questions as a salesperson, I want to know, does this person have the problems that I solve? Do they want to solve them? And who are they in the actual buying decision process? Are they a sales rep who has almost no authority, can't really do anything on their own, probably isn't going to buy this unless it's a $5 a month widget? Fine, that's okay. But then my job once I get on that call is to convince them or get them to convince me that I should talk to their manager or their VP or their owner or whoever it is. That's my job now. So because I'm armed with that information that they have a pain and I know exactly what it is, they want to solve that pain and I know where they fit in the decision-making process. But that example there was obviously a lower value. You wouldn't hit them straight away. Out of the 20 people who join and the 15 who fill in the form, there's probably going to be 2 or 3 owners in there, or 2 or 3 founders, or 2 or 3 CEOs who have told you that they have a pain you solve. They've told you they want to fix it. Now you get on the phone, and the first question I'm going to ask, the first thing that's going to come out of my mouth, well, I have, whenever I do a sales call, it's not the first thing because I have my 5 rules that everyone has to agree to before we continue. but that's a whole nother talk show. The thing that I'm going to ask them is, okay, so you filled this form in. Why now? Why not 6 months ago? Why not next year? We're recording this in summer of 2022. So what I'm saying at the moment is, why not 6 months ago, or why not 2023? Why are we talking now? And they're going to give you a lot of ammunition. Like, they're going to just unload on you there. Or they're going to say nothing and they're going to be really reserved. That's okay. Both of those options are possible. But what I want to get to is, why did they fill the form in? Why did they agree, yes, I have this pain point, and yes, I want to solve that problem, and I'm a founder or a CEO, or I am a person, I've done this before. I've bought something in my life. If I'm the CEO of a 50-person business, I've probably bought lots of somethings in my life. Because every one of them needs an office chair, for example. So this is a known buyer. They know you're going to reach out to them afterwards. If they don't, they're not the CEO. They're full of shit. They're lying to you. Sorry, am I allowed to swear on this, Tom? I just realized
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Sorry, anyone who got offended. Probably a good qualifier out that if you don't like swearing, I'm not the person for you. But
just tracking the live stat. Half the audience has just dropped off.
And I'm okay with that, because that means half the audience don't want to work with me, and that's fine. Exactly. My job is to find out, do you have the pains that I solve? Do you still want to solve them? And who are you in the decision-making process? And if you're the sort of person who's going to be offended by me swearing, we shouldn't work together. Like, just straight up, we shouldn't work.
So that was just a brief segment there from the podcast that I did with Scott recently. We're going to be sending that out as well via email afterwards. It's actually a really good episode. We spoke for over an hour in the end, but we've trimmed it down to a little bit less than that. Loads of great stuff that Scott was talking about, how to utilize the survey in order to drive the sales conversation forward. What sort of questions you should be asking, how to sort of introduce some urgency into that process as well. So some general sales stuff in there for people that are kind of running a sales and marketing organization and need a bit of support with sales. But also some very specific stuff about sales within the context of webinars themselves as well. Right, okay, on to there we go. On to our next guest, who is Dan. Dan, are you there? I can't see you at the moment, I'm afraid. Oh, he's disappeared. Come back, Dan. Don't be afraid. Okay, while Dan's sorting that out, so we're just going to also put up in the background the Atomley survey. So let me just do that. So as I said earlier, the survey is designed to gather, and I know it's a little bit meta because obviously you guys are now going to fill this in. We're not going to be pushy salespeople after this, don't worry. But effectively what we're doing here is we're helping ourselves to understand you as an audience. We're gathering feedback as well, giving you an opportunity to provide us with some comments, also donating to charity, and giving you the opportunity to take advantage of the free first session of the masterclass as well. So please do, I'm going to kick that off, and that's going to go on in the background. Please do fill that in as we go. Dan, hello.
I made it. Sorry about that. I'm good at disappearing.
No worries at all. Nice to see you again. You came along to one of the previous sessions. How have you been?
Yeah, all good. Yeah, sorry to hear about the COVID, mate. So yeah, it's summer in Wales. You have to be ill. Well, so yeah, I'm in Wales and the sun's out, so I'm great. So
yeah, it makes it difficult when it's so hot outside. I have to say, I am sweating right now, but we're going to push forward. We're going to be fine. So obviously, Dan, you're a B2B conversion copywriter. You've worked with some of the big tech companies. You work a lot with us and help us to write content for the webinar content and also all that satellite content as well. So my first question to you is, how do you go from a webinar recording or a set of slides like the ones that I was just presenting towards deciding which pieces of content to produce, and why is it so important to produce like all these various different types of content?
Yeah, it's a good question. When you think about how much work goes into a webinar, this is the fourth webinar now about webinars. There's a lot of research that you've done to get to this point, and to just have it just be go out in one webinar would be a waste. So I think right from the very beginning, you're looking at, right, okay, as you're doing this research, so much research into developing the very best webinar that you can on the subject, you're still limited with time. We're like, right, 40-minute webinar here, some go on for an hour, but even then, you're only able to do a relatively surface level. Yes, you can explore some topics there, but there's no way that you're going to be able to cover everything that you want to on the topic and everything that you've researched. So I think you're looking at then for that satellite content, yeah, you want to do an overall a blog post or an article where you can be like, right, we held this webinar, use your slides as that little outline for doing a big article, a big pillar post there that you can have on your site. But then for all those slides, we've gone, all right, I did this research, but I didn't get the opportunity to go into it on the webinar. Brilliant, now's your opportunity. And then you can use, as you've already brought out really well as well, in different formats. So get it in there. Just really, there's so much to offer then doing a webinar that just go nuts, you know, try different things, explore different formats, but put all that hard work, don't let any of it go to waste.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's one of the things that we say regularly to our clients. Usually we start on an engagement where we do one webinar with them. We do all the research with them, we put the slides together. And like you say, there's a gold mine of stuff that you can go way deeper on. So even just beyond the satellite content for that webinar, you can create a whole series of webinars off the back of just one webinar where you drill down into the subtopics that you've spoken about as well. So some of the types of content that I spoke about during the main slides were, articles, podcasts, audiograms, infographics. There's loads of different types of things. You're a copywriter, so typically we would work together on producing an article or a blog post that goes a little bit deeper into one of the subtopics of the webinar itself. So what do you need to keep in mind when you're writing articles, but also generally the supporting copy that goes with any of these snippets or any of these bits of satellite content? And how do you make sure that the content actually drives us towards the goal, which is generating leads or generating customers?
Well, that second question in a way answers that first, is having that goal in mind at all times. It's like, right, okay, we've done this webinar to generate leads, to generate customers, generate revenue. So as you go into doing those articles, those posts, those podcasts, think, right, okay, what am I using this content for? A lot of the time it will be to complement that main goal that you've had. Right, okay, I want to use this to generate leads. Sometimes it may not be directly that. It might just be for building your brand, building awareness. But generally you're going to want to have that clear sort of call to action then that you can have at the end of any of those posts. But you've got to remember that this is going out to people who've seen the webinar, and it's going out to people who maybe were interested but didn't turn up on the day. It's going out to people who already follow you, who know nothing about the webinar. So you can't take anything for granted. It's for those who have watched the webinar, it's a brilliant opportunity to remind them, because as you say, post-webinar, if you don't act quickly, it can drop off that activity. So being able to come back and get that attention, like, oh yeah, Tom brought out some really good points, so I must work with him sometime. But then for those who didn't watch the webinar, you can't just leap straight in without any sort of context. Go, all right, this was a really good snippet. You have to be able to give them the context. You have to be able to build up almost to like a mini webinar, like, right, what is the problem we're trying to solve with this little snippet? What is the solution that this snippet provides? So making sure that everybody who sees that content, it gets maximum value out of it, and that it gives maximum value to you as a content marketer, as a producer, that you are able to move closer to your goals as a result.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, obviously, I spoke about during it's good to start to plan all of this out at least a few weeks in advance of the webinar itself. Yeah. Obviously, there's certain pieces of content that you cannot produce until you've got the recording. So you can't do it until the evening of the webinar in order to post it the next day. For example, doing the short 2 or 3 minute snippets, you have to have the recording in order to create those. But things like writing an article or a blog post, obviously that can be done in advance, right? So would you recommend, as you're doing the research, you're putting the slides together and you're bringing everything together, that you start to take note of some of the subtopics and areas that you might want to go into a bit more detail in a couple of paragraphs in an article, and then actually write that article in advance? So when would you suggest the best time to actually prepare and publish that article? Obviously at some point before the webinar goes live, preferably, but
I think it's quite organic anyway in the process. Like you say, you're doing this research, you're planning your slides for the webinar. That is almost can be used for the outline for a post. So you can have that post ready to go as soon as the webinar is finished, because you're like, right, we already know what we've planned out on it. And as you're doing that research, you'll likely find yourself going off on those little tangents there that you can't afford to go into for the webinar. But rather than sticking in a pin in it, where you can, I do suggest to sort of go with that flow of like, right, okay, this is something that, a topic that I've just started looking into in terms of presenting it to an audience. So now I want to go deeper. That interests me, that I presume that will interest my customers. Hopefully you're doing that in your research where you're talking to your customers beforehand to find out what concerns them. So yeah, without me going off on a tangent now, is to see that, right, okay, as you're producing the content, you'll see those things that, right, grab your attention, those gems that come up that you weren't expecting. And where you can, as you say, the more you can keep that momentum going, because if you are waiting till the end, yes, there's going to be bits that you can't do. You're going to find gems in the webinar. Go, oh, brilliant. That was a great quote that came out. Oh, what Scott said there, that was fantastic. I want to have that there. You can't plan for all of that. There's that certain serendipity where it comes together. But for the bits that you are, so you can keep that momentum going rather than having the webinar and then a month later, 2 months later, next year, going, all right, here's this brilliant little blog post that relates to it. Here's this brilliant social infographic that relates to it. As much as you can keep the momentum going, great, go for it.
Yeah, no, the momentum is like critically important, because like you said, a lot of content doesn't have actually a short, like one of the other things that I was going to say, I think I didn't mention it actually during the delivery of the previous piece, but a lot of this content has a much longer shelf life than you think it does, but you still need to build. You can't just drop something 3 months, like you say, you can't just drop something 3 months later completely out of context.
Yeah.
So having that momentum and keeping it.
You can, a good webinar to a large degree is evergreen. People will be able to watch this webinar today, they'll be able to watch it next week, they'll be able to watch it next month, and it'll still deliver value because it's evergreen. And so you can keep that going. But there is that sort of, when somebody's launching an album, or when Rihanna launches the next album, you have all the press interviews. And that's because you have that momentum building up. There's that excitement that goes with it. And as much as you can, ride that wave where, like, right, this is something that somebody's interested enough that they've given up 40 minutes of their time to come and sit and listen. And now you want to follow up on that because they may not be that interested 6 months down the line. Life comes along, distractions come along. So if you can keep that, then yeah, great, use it. And don't just like, okay, well, we did this webinar and we're never going to use it again after 2022. You can revisit it, you can repurpose that content going forward. But it's a mistake not to do it at the time as well.
Yeah, and also from the sales perspective, obviously, people that have joined the webinar and have responded on the survey saying, I've got a current need and I want to solve it soon, that's going to be irrelevant because they're going to find an alternative supplier, or the problem's going to get solved for them in some other way, unless you can take advantage of that pretty quickly. So that's obviously around the sort of targeting of specific individuals, but it's also generally it applies to the marketing piece as well. If you can get that virality and you can get people talking about it, it's much more likely that they're actually going to have a current need that they want to solve when they come to you proactively.
Yeah, it's showing up on the LinkedIn. Somebody who's like watched this webinar now and is seeing that, then if they're seeing those snippets coming up, it's like that statistic. It's probably been debunked somewhere, but there's a sort of law that, all right, somebody has to see your brand 7 times before they'll make a purchase from you.
Yeah.
Whether that's exactly accurate, I'm not going to pretend to say. But the principle behind that of being like, all right, they've seen you here, and oh right, I have signed up for that, or I've joined that newsletter. Oh, I'm seeing this on the LinkedIn. I'm seeing this on the podcast. Oh, that podcast who I really enjoy listening to, they're talking about this now. This is great. And it just helps really get that awareness up.
Absolutely. And last question that I wanted to ask, because we're at 1:45 now, don't want to overrun too much. Hopefully this is useful for people watching. So obviously the sort of spear phishing, the direct targeted sales strategy that we talked about, we heard from Scott already the importance of using the phone as part of that. But obviously email and LinkedIn messaging, text messaging, not SMS, but messaging via text, using the medium of text, is another way of doing that. So have you got any tips for making sure that when you're building those targeted emails, or even more generally the newsletter content and other things that you would write afterwards, how do you make sure that that includes the learnings that you learn on the webinar? Because often people will ask a question, or or the aggregated survey responses will come through, and actually you find that people are more interested in a different topic to what you might have thought. So have you got any tips for how to sort of like consolidate all that down and then make sure it hits the right audience in the right way from a copy point of view?
Yeah, certainly. You're right. It's the most important thing is that you are using it, that you're not setting up these polls, these Q&As, these surveys, and they're run for the sake of it and you never look at them again. So just the very fact that you're running them and you're then using them, it's such a gold mine. As a copywriter, my big thing is research. You don't just sit and write up an email off the top of your head. You base it off what you know about your audience. And while you can do that customer research, if you're following up on a webinar and you've asked on the webinar, what's your biggest challenge regarding X? That is huge. You can then respond in your follow-up copy. If you're doing it, you talked in your buckets there, didn't you, about the gold, the silver, the bronze. For those gold ones who've responded in the survey and are high ICP, you can go to them and go, right, you said that this was your biggest challenge. Can you tell me more about that? Here's how we can help. In another thing that helps as well is establishing your authority, because when you reach out in your email marketing or direct emails, you can talk about, right, okay, we've done this research. We found that when we asked people what their biggest concern was, it was this. And then you say, right, 58% of people were concerned about this problem. You're giving them something that's interesting. Oh, I'm not alone. You know, other people are facing this same challenge as well. That's always good to know when you realize that the challenges you're facing aren't the only one. And so being able to use that in the messaging then. So especially for those gold ones, really super high personalization, using what you've learned. I mean, you brought out a really good point then about visiting their site, you know, doing that little bit of research there to make sure it's personalized, to make sure it's relevant. Something I talk about is that sort of sincere flattery. And sincere is the most important word there, because when you've gone onto somebody's site, you want to be able to say something there that, right, I saw this on your site, that really stood out to me. Can you tell me more? Being able to talk about those kind of things with the people on your list. Just say about that example there, where you can show it where it's not just you're talking about some random blog post from 5 years ago, where you can talk about something that they are doing, something that's important to them in their business, then they're actually going to pay attention. It's when they know it's sincere, it's going to be a lot more effective than just, all right, here's another cold email, or here's another email that's just being automated. Yes, you can use automation, but use those personalization snippets. A lot of these automation software will allow you to personalize quite large sections of it. So you can be like, right, okay, I'm reaching out to Elon Musk at Tesla. I can say, right, what you've done here, been very impressed with, or I've not been very impressed with, depending on your views on Elon Musk. But then you are looking at what's going on their site. And if they're those gold medal candidates, if they really match your ICP, they're worth the effort then of doing that bit of research and personalizing it so that it is 100% tailored to them.
Yeah. Yeah, like I said earlier, I think automation's great. We use it a lot. I used to be an automation consultant, and building entire sales and marketing funnels that are based on automation. But actually, ultimately, if you've got the reason why you use automation is because you don't have the personal information, and that level of personalization isn't possible. But when you do have it, and you've got direct answers to direct questions that tell you exactly what their problem statement is and when they want to solve it and how they want to solve it, why wouldn't you use that information, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I think a lot of young salespeople nowadays have been brought up on automation, which is fine, it's fair enough. Like, most SDRs are tasked with managing an automation system rather than generating their own leads most of the time. But being able to now flip to doing hyper personalization again, like they did in the good old days, is going to be the way forward again.
Absolutely. I think having it where you can have a mix of it, when you do have that system where you have got that gold, silver, bronze, makes it a lot easier, because it could be like, right, okay, if they don't meet bronze, then I will use a general automation, because you don't know that much about them. You're like, right, okay, they didn't turn up to the webinar. I don't know that much about them, but based on my research, they face these problems. They're considering these competitors. They're looking for these solutions. So that's what automation is designed for. But then for those gold ones, as you say, if you've got the information, you wouldn't, if you were sat there talking to them face to face, you wouldn't just be using the same pitch that you'd use on every other prospect that you've spoken to. You'd make it about them. So having that same attitude as if you were face to face is so much more powerful.
Absolutely, 100%. Cool. Well, we've come up to the end of the time. Thanks everyone for sticking around for a few extra minutes. Hope that was useful. We don't actually have any Q&A questions today, funnily enough, so I'm not going to ask any. I don't know what's going on. To be honest, it's a hot day.
Yeah.
It's classic summer. I think we have had less attendance today than we would normally have, granted. So thank you to the people that did come and spent 50 minutes of your time. It's been hot. Thank you for doing that and staying inside when you could be at the pub in the beer garden. So we appreciate that. Dan, thank you very much for your time again. Scott, I know he's not here, but he's out there in the ether somewhere. Thank you for your contributions as well. Yeah, thanks, Scott. This is the last in the series of webinars that we're doing at the moment. We'll be back with another bunch of webinars in September, October time. And we're launching our masterclass, so everyone's going to hear a lot about that as well. In the meantime, if anyone wants to get in touch to ask any questions about anything that we've discussed today, please do email me, tom@atomley.com. If you need any copywriting services, please go to Dan. He's the best in the biz as far as I'm concerned. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we'll speak to you again soon. Thanks, Dan.
Cheers. Thanks, everyone.